Callanish, the Moon and the Sleeping Beauty, presented by Gerald Ponting. In this lecture, Gerald illustrates some of his fascinating research he's been doing at Callanish, including the rediscovery of lost features by combining documentary studies with work in the field. Recorded live at Megalithomania Conference 2007.
So here we are at Callanish. Stones along a ridge overlooking East Loch Roag on the Isle of Lewis. Let's locate ourselves in the Outer Hebrides with Callanish right up there. Incidentally, the alternative spelling is a Gallicization. I think it's a bit of political correctness, really, because Callanish was never originally a Gallic word. It came from the Old Norse, probably meaning the place from which one called a ferry to cross the Sound. So I disagree with historic Scotland and prefer to stick to the English spelling. The Isle of Lewis has spectacular scenery, particularly on the coastline, and behind the coast, crofting landscapes with people doing a bit of, not growing much in the way of crops these days, and with the old croft houses falling into ruin, replaced by new modern ones. But the centre of the island is peaty moorland, occupied mainly with sheep, gathered together for the traditional thank for sheep shearing and for other activities through the year. This is the house where I lived from 1974 to 1984, moving there from Suffolk, intending to do a bit of the attempt at self-sufficiency, and you can see the hayfield and the vegetable plot, and also the goat. And here, with my 1970s hairstyle, you can see the human members of the family and some of the animal members of the family. Here we have a view overlooking the whole area of Callanish, with the mountains of Harris very obvious in the background. The house where I lived is there, the Callanish stones are there, but most of the water which you can see there, East Loch Roag, was probably dry land at the time that the stones were in use. This is the view from our home at one point, and you can see some of the standing stones there. And it was rather wonderful to sit in our sun lounge and be able to just look through the binoculars and see what was going on there, until one of our neighbours decided to build a house about where that sheep is. Incidentally, I've only fairly recently gone over to digital photography, and just to do this to PowerPoint rather than showing slides, some of these slides are pretty poor quality because I've got copy slides, and some of these are digital copies of slide copies. So occasionally there are pictures where the quality isn't that good. The pictures are all mine, except where you've got some credit elsewhere. This is quite an early picture of the area. There are the stones of Callanish with the big oval and the site sometimes known as Callanish 2 in the circle at the top, and Callanish village street stretching back from the stones. The building in the... Oh, sorry, that was... I'm not familiar with this thing. You see, I'm pressing the wrong button here. Ah, there we are. That is Callanish Farm, which at this time was a farmstead, but it's now occupied by a research department of Edinburgh University Archaeology Department, and next to it you will find the modern-day Callanish Visitor Centre, which they very usefully cited not within vision of the stones. So the regular visitor today goes to the visitor centre there and walks up to the stones. So in 1974, we arrived on the island, bought a house, as it happened, a mile from the site, and being the sort of people who are interested in their surroundings and generally interested in archaeology, but with no background in that, we decided to find out what we could about the site. But there was very little readily available in print. Then we came across Professor Tom and his plan of Callanish, although not rarely based on his own survey. But the usefulness to us at that point was that he had a fairly extensive bibliography, and we started to track down some of the old documents which he'd recorded and then following up their bibliography. And gradually, by borrowing books through the interlibrary service and getting photocopies sent from Edinburgh and elsewhere, we gradually built up an assemblage of the old material on Callanish. We were both teaching at the time, had children to bring up, goats to keep, etc., etc., and this was all going on at the same time. Never been so busy in all my life as when I lived in the Outer Hebrides. Within 18 months of moving to the island, we decided we'd got the information to put together a guidebook to the site, which had never been done before. The local printer said, yes, I'll do that for you. I'll print you 1,000 copies. And I won't give you the bill until you come back for your second 1,000. I'm so confident. That took from May 1976 to August 1976. It was on sale on the island for a period of 7 years, and was eventually replaced by that book, which I think you will still find on sale on the Isle of Lewis today. I keep saying we. This was myself and my first wife, whom many of you will know, if not in person, by reputation, as Margaret Curtis, still living in the same house and still doing a lot of research. And the majority of the research I'm talking about is work which we did jointly between 74 and 84. If you've read about Margaret, you will no doubt have come across in Julian Cope's book, where he devotes an entire chapter to Callanish. And I was rather, this is completely untrue, especially who starts out with learning what everybody else has done before and is not likely to initiate anything very new. Well, you can judge for yourselves whether that's true of what we did. This isn't really the place to go into this, but I will just mention the fact that I had a moment of seething fury when I read this book first, because one paragraph refers to my breaking up and divorce from Margaret Curtis and moving back to Hampshire totally inappropriately. He'd never met me. What right had he to say anything about my state of mind? Anyway, let's leave that to one side. Here we have the plan of the site, plan which I've put together based on one in 1928. And you can see that as well as the central stone circle, you have a row of stones to the west, to the east, to the south. You also have a double row running slightly east of north. We'll look at each of those in turn. The next picture is taken from that point, but not at ground level. There's a story behind this. I said we could see the stones from the house. Well, one morning we noticed there was a crane with its jib suspended above the stones. I rushed up there and discovered that the organisation that's now known as Historic Scotland had sent a photographer to hire a light plane. He'd failed, so he'd hired a crane with a basket in order to take aerial photographs for picture postcards. So I hitched a ride. And there we see we're looking... we'll get used to this in a minute. We're looking more or less south here. There's the south row. There's the group of stones known as Knock-and-Tuas in the background, which we'll come to later. And there again is Callanish Farm. So let's look at the various different parts. The central circle, 13 stones ranging from 8 to 12 feet high. Another view of some of the interesting shapes of the stones. At the center of the circle, you see the tallest stone of all, almost 16 feet high, and almost incredible that stood there since prehistoric times without falling. The avenue, which runs, as I say, slightly east of north, I'll come to a more complicated theory as to why it's like that later, but the simple explanation is that it runs along the top of the ridge, so that whether you're in either valley down either side, you're looking up and see the stones silhouetted there. So that's looking northwards. And here we are again, still looking northwards, and you can see Callanish village. But if Callanish village wasn't there, if that stretch of water wasn't there, and you were able to walk another mile in a straight line along that avenue, you would get to this site, which was only discovered in 1999. The council was going to widen and straighten the road, and this was discovered, and despite all protestations, they still put the road through, and so there's only half of the site there today. Incidentally, the building in the background is the primary school that both of my children attended, and the house where I lived is about 50 yards behind me as I take this photograph. If you look now at that, which is looking at as the site would have been from the other direction, not only is this absolutely in line with the avenue, but also the entrance passage into this cairn also lines up with the Callanish stones in the distance. So it does give some impression that maybe there was a mile-long processional way leading up to the stones, which has now been lost. This is the avenue again, looking at it from the other direction. And at this point, you can see the hills of the Sleeping Beauty, which you've already met today in Stuart's talk. And we'll come back to the significance of standing here and looking at the Sleeping Beauty hills later. The west row there, we've got one of the circle stones in the foreground, and the west row beyond it, 4 stones. Just as a little warning of people who are too keen on finding alignments, that row of stones is due east-west, but not true east-west, national grid east-west. And I don't think the people who built it knew anything about the national grid. The row of stones to the... the row of stones to the east there, we've got 5 stones there, but I'll say a little bit more on how that came to be later. The row of stones to the south, yes, this is due north-south. Professor Tom's already been mentioned, and I'm sure most of you are fully aware of the huge amounts of surveying work which he did in his spare time from his professorship of engineering and in his retirement. But it was this line of stones that originally inspired him. On a family yachting trip in, I think it was late 20s or early 30s, they moored down below, they walked up here, had a personal letter from Tom explaining all of this, and he noticed that this line was absolutely due north-south. And he started thinking, no pole star in those days to line it up to. How did they do it? And that really was the inspiration for all his future work. Let's just go back to that a moment. Beyond that, you can see the natural rock outcrop beyond the gate. Here it is, Crocantursa, which translates as hillock of sadness. And this has one odd feature which may or may not be natural. At one corner, there is what appears to be a perfect seat. There I am sitting on it, very comfortable spot. And if you look, while we're waiting, I'll tell you another little story in relation to that crane. There was a couple, the only other visitors, tourists there, was an Italian couple. And the man was obviously a keen photographer, and having seen the chap from Historic Scotland go up in the basket and me go up in the basket, he asked for a ride as well and also got a photograph. Now, that Italian couple had arrived after the crane had arrived, and they left before it left. And I always imagine this Italian chap going and showing his slides to the Milan Towns Women's Guild and saying, they have this marvellous facility for visitors at Callanish. Right, yes, we were just starting to look at this, and I was saying that when you're sitting on that seat, you're looking straight over the south row and the central stone, and you're looking due north. Fingers crossed that that's not going to happen again. Among the many old documents which we obtained was a series of superb pencil sketches of individual stones done by a gentleman whom we knew only as Mr. Sharbough. Here is his illustration of stone 19, and here is one done by Pitt Rivers' assistant 25 years later. On looking at it in 1977 and climbing up to the top with a step ladder and checking the measurements, we thought, yes, between those two dates, the top was broken off. You can see the sort of damage to it. I was putting the step ladder away in the van, and in one of those serendipity moments, Margaret walked over to that low stone wall, which you can see there, and said, I think I found the top to that stone. I sort of expressed a certain amount of doubt, got the step ladder out, took it up, and it was a perfect fit. That had been lying there for 100 years or more. So, so we kept it in our sun lounge for about a year. And then along came Mr. McPhee from the Ancient Monuments Department, glued it back on, and the local newspaper, the Stornoway Gazette, had it as a headline, tip for the top. Anyway, there should be a plan there from 1819, and it showed all the different stones, and it showed a lot of the stones as either erect or fallen. And stone 34 was one that was shown as fallen. And his little sketch of it on his plan matched perfectly this shape that was drawn in 1885. But that isn't the whole of Pitt River's drawing. In fact, there had been peat enveloping the stones. Anybody who visited the site before 1857 was walking around on a ground level 5 feet higher than today's. So all of the stones which McCulloch thought were fallen were simply only seeing the top. He thought they were much smaller stones lying on their side. Peat is partially decomposed plant material. It grows when it started growing, we believe, round about the beginning of the Iron Age, when the climate deteriorated, built up over the centuries and the millennia, and completely enveloped the standing stones and, in fact, much of the Isle of Lewis. Cutting peat for fuel was very much the standard thing that pretty well everyone did when I was living there, but it's declined very much in popularity more recently. One of the earliest visitors, I think the earliest visitor to the Callanish to make a sketch of it, was Jacob Vorso, a Danish archaeologist. If you look at the top picture, all the stones of the avenue of the circle look much too short. This is because he was walking on a ground surface 5 feet higher than today's. And from this sketch, you can see that the local people were actually cutting their peats along there. You can see a chap with a peat iron. You can see a couple of people with creels, baskets on their back to carry the peat away. And the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland was quite a new society at that point. And Henry Callender, in his paper, suggested to them that rather than let the locals just haphazardly carry on, they should apply to the owner of the island. Yes, one man owned the entire island, Sir James Matheson, should apply to him to have the peat cleared away. This was done in 1857. 10 years later, you see a sketch which clearly shows the tide mark, the bleached level where the peat had been. And you can also see that there is something that they've discovered here, a burial chamber, looking a bit too cosmetically tidy there, but this is the chamber as it looks today. And this is Patrick Ashmore's idea of how it probably looked. Patrick Ashmore directed a major excavation at Callanish for 4 weeks in 1980 and 5 or 6 weeks in 1981, and we are still waiting for the report on that excavation. Another document which we discovered in the archives in Edinburgh was Palmer's plan of 1857. This clearly wasn't the original because what they've got in Edinburgh is on tracing paper, but the east row is particularly interesting. We checked all his measurements. So we found that between stone 30 and stone 31, it was actually 8 feet. It was another 19 foot 6 to 32, all his measurements accurate, 20 foot 6 to stone 33. But beyond the site fence, he showed another stone which was no longer there, which we then designated 33A. Now, of course, if you had all the geophysics that Time Team has nowadays, you could have just gone across with some electronic equipment in a few seconds and found out whether it was there or not. It actually took us 2 days. with a metal probe. Now that's one of the pictures that's in fact a very poor copy, so that will show you more clearly what instrument we were using, a metal rod graduated in centimetres and 10 centimetres, and we were able to prove in fact that there was something down there. We got it published in Current Archaeology for reasons I'll explain in a moment. And those markers outline where the stone was. This bit of land was crofted by our postman, and he'd given us permission to do this. And of course, his immediate reaction was, let's go and get the spade. But we put in the report to the authorities in Edinburgh and waited and waited and waited. In the meantime, we entered a competition run by BBC Chronicle. That was how that came to be there. And we were awarded an award for initiative by the Prince of Wales, £100 in the case of champagne, and 2 trips to London to publicise it. And we also had our own 10-minute spot on Chronicle, but stone 33A was still beneath the ground. And it wasn't until the 1981 excavation that the stone was uncovered just beyond the wall. There it is, excavated, and a week or so later, in a somewhat carnival atmosphere with the children of the local primary school along, including my son sitting there somewhere, this was lifted out and put to one side. They excavated underneath, they found the socket hole. 2 years later, because it took that time for the lawyers in Edinburgh to sort out the swap over a bit of land between the croft and the site. 2 years later, Patrick Ashmore there overseeing the stone being put back into its socket hole. And so there we are, the east row, which before we started our investigations of all the old documents was only 4 stones, and since we did those investigations, there are now 5 stones in the east row. We tried to get all of this published, and various publishers took it on and then dropped it and so on. So it simply became a series of photocopied volumes deposited in various libraries. And it was only thanks to John Martineau, who's sitting here today, that I think 23 years on, long after I'd moved back to Hampshire, I was able to put together a little book, on sale downstairs, put together a little book reproducing a lot of these old documents. And if you're particularly interested in them, I've got a big folder with me with large versions of all of these you could have a look at. That particular plan had not been in print previously. It's not the Stukely, which is in a number of books. It's the original in Stukely's commonplace book in the museum in Devizes. As I say, available downstairs. Anyway, Callanish with wonderful sunrises and sunsets, and Callanish there with a sun pillar. You perhaps recognise that as stone 34, the one that we did the peat levels on. And this sort of atmospheric effect is caused by ice crystals in the upper atmosphere, and that's the most spectacular shot I ever got of something like that. You do see this sort of thing if you keep your eyes open down in the south of England occasionally, but this was a particularly spectacular sun halo with sun dogs either side. And that particular photo has earned me quite a bit of money over the years, having been published in a Time Life book, and even with appalling colour reproduction on a Brook Bond tea card. This is perhaps my one of my favourite shots of Callanish. Keith was describing being in a horizontal snowstorm. Well, I wasn't actually out in the snowstorm because it was overnight, but obviously this was a horizontal snowstorm which blasted the stones. And this was January 1982. I was teaching in Stornoway and travelling 19 miles across the moor, but that particular morning it was far too much snow for anybody to get to school, so I had a day off. And I unfortunately got up there and got the shot before anybody had walked among the stones. If that picture looks marginally familiar, then it was actually on the cover of Third Stone, sadly departed Third Stone magazine some little while back. Right, let's move on to some of the other sites around Callanish. The main site is there. There are other circles in these spots and other standing stones round about. We don't, of course, have time to look at all of these. If you go up there and want to visit them, a book which I put together in 1984, still available in Lewis, is the only real sort of field guide to going and finding where these other sites are. The one nearest the other stones, Callanish 2, Croch Calanais, 5 standing stones, but various other features showing. And here we have a plan which was done 1858. The significance of that date, the year after they'd cleared the peat from the main stones, they went and cleared them from the smaller sites round about. And various features were found, including this. The rather gullible gentleman who put this paper together thought that these were deliberately inscribed marks that might have some meaning. As a result, that stone was taken to Stornoway away for its protection, and as far as I can gather, eventually broken up for roadworks. This whole story of that stone was actually written up in third stone. Perhaps the most popular of the minor sites is Callanish 3, Croch Fillerveg, and this one has a particularly good view of the Sleeping Beauty. Kayach na Moinchach. It's your opinion as to how you translate Kayach. I have heard it translated as Old Hag of the Moors, but Old Woman of the Moors is fine. And there's the same picture of mine which Stuart used this morning, taken from a slightly different spot and with some of the peat smoke coming up from the village houses in the foreground. Even if you get closer to her, she still looks reasonably convincing. And I did once go and walk up on there, and that nose is quite a prominent outcrop of rock. When they cleared the peat from Callanish 4, Chen Hulevig, they only cleared it within the site, and so it stands now in a damp hollow, but it's more remote perhaps than most of the other sites that people can easily get to. And also, the Historic Scotland people haven't been in and cleared all the lichens off, a bit of official vandalism which has been done at the other sites. When I lived there, to get to this spot, you had to jump a ditch and climb a fence. And you can see now that they've put in an access path even for some of these less obvious sites. A bit of a trek across the moors, and you get across to Callanish 5, Ari Nam Bideran. There are these 3 stones in a straight alignment, various other features hiding under the heather. But if you look along those line of 3 stones, you're looking straight at the Sleeping Beauty's knees. Those 2 bits there, that's the rest of the Sleeping Beauty is out of sight there, and that's just a natural rock outcrop. As we'll see later, there is an occasion when the moon just appears in that little space. Then we have Callanish 5, Cletcher, sometimes just known as Burner Bridge because it's next to that bridge there, a site which has been modified in various ways over recent years, at least 2 stones re-erected, and a rather unusual site in that it's a sort of semicircle with the diameter being a sheer cliff face. Now the next picture does show a number of people who are here today. This was an occasion last June when I was doing a guided tour to a group of Americans, and we turned up there at the same time as Stuart's group. Just across the bridge, this stone is standing on its own, known as 8A. This wasn't standing in the time that I lived in Lewis. In fact, here's a picture that I've pulled off somebody's website showing Margaret and her second husband, Ron, putting it back into place. So I assure you, I think they had more than just the 2 of them moving that thing. This is the spot where we took the overview before, Callanish 11, lovely position there, looking down over the whole region, and again, with certain other features lying around in there if you study it in detail. A domesticated megalith. It is in its right place, but the housing estate was built around it and a plinth created to protect it. Now, Achmore, this has been referred to as Callanish 22, but I prefer not to call it. It's about 8-9 miles from Callanish. The local people had for some time suspected that they'd got the remains of a stone circle up on the hillside, but they hadn't told anyone till they came along to us when the 81 excavation was going on, and we decided to go up and investigate what there was up on this bit of moorland, and the local newspaper got interested and got us involved there. But we found that in order to check what was there, we had to do a number of keyhole excavations, all of which today are just completely flooded with the stone invisible down in the bottom there. We put together a book with all our results. This is a peat bank. So these stones had all been uncovered previously. That was the only one that was really erect. So we've plotted this. We then plotted that in the deep peat, did the keyhole excavations and proved that those were there. It's one of the largest circles in Scotland, and it is absolutely circular, which according to Aubrey Burl's theories probably means it's a lot earlier than the Callanish sites. I was quite surprised when I went back last year that it now has not only, well, I knew it had been scheduled, but I didn't realise it was now going to have a brown tourist sign, a path and a plinth, or that the plinth would have a very familiar looking plan on it. Right, we go back to Callanish 1, the main site, and Professor Tom's diagram. Now, what he calls line A east and line A west are in fact the two lines of the avenue looking up towards the central circle. And his theory was the moon at its furthest south would skim slightly behind Clisham and disappear down the end of the avenue. But as I said, he hadn't done his own surveys here. He'd relied on Somerville's surveys, and he didn't take this outcrop of rocks into account. So that view is not actually visible from there. We've been into this already, so let's not spend too much time on this. Just notice that the angles when we're at Callanish are much more acute than in the south of England. The sun rises much further north and sets much further north in the summer, so that you get very long summer days and very short winter days. This is now failing to operate some of the time. Working fine just now. Right, let's talk about this one then. You have to imagine that we are not looking at this on a flat screen, but that you are in a planetarium and that this is projected on the inside of the dome, and the east and west are out either side of your ears, so that the northern extreme... No, not going to work. It's gone on too. This is hopeless. Right. The northern extreme, the moon is going to be way up in the sky and in the sky for most of the 24 hours. But for the southern extreme there, it's only just going to skim over the horizon for a few hours. There's the northern extreme, there's the southern extreme. Starting to behave itself again, please. Can we do something about that up there if I can't do it? Right. This is just to underline the fact that you don't have to be there at precisely the right month. It's very simplified in that it's not always the full moon, and lunar months obviously are shorter than ordinary months. But even if you don't get there when it's at its very lowest, a few months either side, you will find it almost as low. So how do we achieve a diagram like this to show what the moon is doing? Well, first of all, Margaret goes out with the theodolite, I go out with the camera, and those results are put together to map very accurately the course of the horizon. We're talking about shadows this morning. Notice that there is a double shadow here. This is because at site 8, there's water over here, and the sun is reflecting in the water, and that is shining on here so that you're getting one shadow from the sun itself and one shadow from the sun reflection. In order to work out where the moon is, you have to go through this complex formula for each position of the moon all across, long before the days of home computers, so all of this was done laboriously on an early programmable calculator. We were greatly helped by the fact, Stuart pointed out that one of the requirements is a map. We were greatly helped by the fact that a year or so before we'd started, the geography department of Glasgow University had done an extremely accurate plan of the main site, the minor sites, and on the back, all the surrounding districts. So that helped enormously. In 1980, we went to a conference, paper published in 1981, in which we put together a lot of these profiles showing our theories of where the sun or the moon rose and set in relation to the horizon. The key page is this one in what I'm talking about today, in particularly the diagram at the top, the same diagram that Stuart used in a rather compressed form. So there we have the Callanish stones, the Sleeping Beauty over at the end here, and the southern path of the moon. Look at that in more detail, and you can see the moon is rising out of the Sleeping Beauty's forehead. It's much further back here today than it would have been in prehistoric times, skimming across behind the east row, and then sort of flashing, as it were, between the stones, and its final appearance being right at the center of the circle at the foot of that tallest stone. All of this is assuming that you're standing at the north end of the avenue, more or less by the side of that stone that had its top glued back on. It's all Greek, but here we have it in English. Again, this is Stuart mentioned this briefly. An island in the north inhabited by the Hyperboreans is on the island a notable temple which is spherical in shape. The moon as viewed from this island appears but a little distance from the earth. The god visits the island every 19 years. That seems to relate very well to Callanish, although various people have related it to Stonehenge. Tie in with that another Greek writer who describes the Hyperboreans' temple as winged. East and west rows? So probably the Greeks knew about Callanish. And if you go to Julian Cope's book, you will see a colour version of essentially what you saw in our book, so in our paper. So a paper published by us in 1981 now starts to appear reproduced in popular books like this, and then starts to get simulated on TV programs. In 1987, the last major standstill, I was making a new life myself back in Hampshire and certainly wasn't inclined to go back up to Lewis that year. But Margaret and Ron got this amazing photograph, which I would love to see, still haven't, of the moon just in the centre of the circle there, glowing between those central stones. So, the Sleeping Beauty. We only put this forward as a pure bit of astroarchaeology. I prefer archaeoastronomy personally. Astroarchaeology to me sounds a bit like too much like going and doing some excavation on Mars. Anyway, this was purely an astronomical description. We didn't sort of make anything of the fact that this was the figure of a female. But of course, other people, once it starts to get popular, soon start to identify this. This is not just a human figure. This is the Earth Mother. This is the White Goddess, etc., etc. And various publications, including these by Jill Smith, who's sitting at the back today, put forward this angle of the theory about Callanish and the Sleeping Beauty. Jill also has done some wonderful paintings interpreting the Sleeping Beauty, and if you catch up with her after this, she no doubt has got some packets of postcards of her paintings available if you'd like them. But this is a nice, cheerful one of the Sleeping Beauty as a sleeping lady. But one of her pictures is much more depressing. She calls it Hoping Not. There is a proposal to build a wind farm all over the hills that form the Sleeping Beauty. One of 2 or 3 wind farms which are suggested planning to industrialize one of the most pristine environments in Europe. You can imagine what I think about that. Another part of this goddess theory is that 3 of the stones at Callanish 3 represent different aspects of the triple goddess, the maiden, the mother, and the crone, and overlooking them is this leaning stone, which has been identified as the phallus. Back to Site 5, I pointed out the moon came through at that point. Here's the calculated profile, and you can see that all that's going to happen is that the moon... Oh, sorry, wrong button. The moon is going to just skim through that little gap and disappear into the heather hillside. The only reason I've put this in is because that alignment of 3 stones, everybody who's studied Callanish alignments at Callanish agree that that one does accurately line up with that particular moon. But of course, the more sceptical people like Clive Ruggles will say, yes, that's just due to chance. You'd get one that worked, wouldn't you? The other interesting feature in the Callanish horizon is this deep V notch of Glen Langerdale. It doesn't come into view from the main Callanish site, but again in 1987, Margaret and Ron got some super pictures of the moon having set behind Clisham and disappeared, a bit like that double sunset at Leek. Here you get a double moon set, or as we normally referred to it, as a re-gleam when the moon disappears and reappears again. As I say, this is not from the main Callanish site, but from an individual stone which is referred to as Callanish 17. If you are in the Callanish area, and these are all the various sites in the Callanish area, incidentally we've got north at the bottom today, if you are in those sites, you will always see this southern moonrise. If you're in this area of Callanish, you're looking towards the moonrise. We should just get one arrow coming up now. It's not going to. If you're looking up, let's do it with this. There we are. If you're looking up towards the Sleeping Beauty, that is where the moon will rise. And if you're looking the other way, this is where the moon will set. Could it even be that the reason why there are so many sites in the Callanish area is that this very spectacular southern moon skim, happening rarely, happening more or less at monthly intervals, but then only again after 18 odd years, could this be the reason of so many sites in the area? So the years of the major standstill, we've seen some shots from 87. I was up there again for the night of the 11th, 12th of June in the hope of seeing these events. And at dusk, it looked really hopeful. The sky was clear. The Sleeping Beauty was standing out beautifully sharp on the horizon. But there were more people at the site than I think I'd ever seen before. That was the previous evening when it was far too wet to see the moon. We did persuade the people with the fire to put it out before the moon was likely to rise. And there we are waiting, everybody standing around, anticipation, is the moon going to come up beyond the Sleeping Beauty? Desultory drumming, a little bit of chanting going on, and then the moon glimmer just starts to appear. The drumming intensifies. If only I'd had my little cassette recorder with me, I could have played it back to you. But there we are, a magical moment as the moon appears out of the Sleeping Beauty's belly. Though remember, in prehistoric times, it would more have been out of her face. An absolutely magical evening. And if you're not right at the stones, but up on Knockntorsa, you get this lovely reflection of the moon in the waters of the loch. So again, probably that wouldn't have happened in prehistoric times because there probably wasn't water there. That may even have been where they had their farmland. I did take one shot through the stones, but it's not from the right direction. It's not when the moon is about to set. We're waiting for the moon transit, and I had to just put this in from somebody else's website. This is actually the following month, but that just sort of worship the moon shot rather appealed to me. But it clouded over, the moon disappeared, we didn't see the moon set. This is a simulation of what we hoped we might have seen that evening. And if you went back next month, you might be lucky enough to see it, admittedly a fair bit higher, but it's just a few chances left to see it setting among the stones. These dates and details have been on my website for some time, and you can see there the dates in 07 that might be worth going. I haven't yet decided whether I'm going to be up there for around about the 2nd, 3rd of June. If anybody's thinking of travelling and want to share transport or anything, I'd love to talk about to them. The alternative, of course, is that we wait to 2025, when I think I might be using my Zimmer frame. Anyway, I hope you've enjoyed looking at this Callanish details and you've learned a little bit. Once again, there should be some music to finish up with, but I don't think it's going to appear. No. Okay. No, thank you very much.
This has been a Megalithomania audio production. For more information, visit megalithomania.co.uk.